The U.S. has intercepted a third vessel off the coast of Venezuela, making this the third operation in less than a week. It's the latest measure from the White House to put pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The current operation by the U.S. Coast Guard is the second in 2 days. Washington says the vessel is part of a fleet under sanctions. On Saturday, the U.S. Coast Guard boarded another oil tanker. The administration says it will pursue the illicit movement of sanctioned oil that is used to fund narco-terrorism. The operations are taking place just days after President Donald Trump announced a blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. All right, we have two correspondents covering this story. Teresa Bo is live for us in Buenos Aires. First, let's go to Heidi Jo Castro, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Heidi, what more do we know at this stage?
Well, according to reports that citing U.S. officials, the U.S. Coast Guard is actively in pursuit of a vessel that is a sanctioned dark fleet vessel, in the words of this official, that is part of Venezuela's illegal sanctions evasion. And according to this report in the Washington Post, this vessel is flying a false flag and is under a judicial seizure order from the U.S. We are awaiting confirmation from the White House. Now, reports are that this vessel in question is named the Bella 1. And according to tanker tracker data, it has not been in Venezuela now for several years and had been making its way toward a port, so it's empty at the moment, with the intention of loading on of oil from Venezuela. This is, of course, following just 24 hours earlier when yet another tanker was indeed arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard. That was the Centuries in the Caribbean waters, carrying some 1.8 million barrels of crude oil. That particular ship was not on the sanctions list. However, a White House spokesperson said that its cargo, which comes from the Venezuelan state oil agency, is sanctioned. And of course, this is all since Donald Trump, the U.S. president, declared that blockade of all sanctioned oil coming in and out of Venezuela. Now we're seeing two tests of that blockade, with the U.S. reacting forcefully in both instances.
Teresa, we know that Caracas condemned the operation that happened on Saturday, the seizure of the second tanker. They had accused Washington of committing a grave act of international piracy. They called it theft and kidnapping. What else are we hearing from Venezuelan officials?
Well, certainly for Venezuelan authorities, what's going on right now is an outrage. They're saying that this is an act of piracy, of theft. They're also saying that they're going to denounce all this at the United Security Council. In fact, they released a statement saying that the government rejects the theft and hijacking of a new private vessel, as well as the forced disappearance of its crew, saying that the United States is responsible for all this. So suddenly there's lots of anger, frustration from the Maduro government after the United States actions. And what is interesting right now is that around 40% of Venezuelans' oil tankers have been sanctioned. They're part of what is known as the shadow fleet. It's a group of oil tankers that are informal oil tankers in a way, that move through irregular routes. And this is what apparently the United States is going after. And the big concern, not only for the Venezuelan government, but also for the population, is what's coming next. What is going to be the impact of all of this in their lives? Venezuela is already struggling with an enormous economic crisis. Inflation is around 500%. The currency has several currencies. It's being affected by all of this. People survive on $1 a day. So certainly there's lots of concerns about the impact that something like this would have on Venezuelan society, and not just the government. And also, it is, what is the main objective? This is not the first time that Nicolas Maduro has been under pressure by the United States. We know that back in 2019, the United States supported a parallel government by Juan Guaido at that time. There's also been sanctions, for example. There's also been military uprisings, and also the entire collapse of the Venezuelan economy that forced around 8 million people out of the country. So the big question is where all of this is leading. That's what the population wants to know right now, because most of the people I have spoken to say that they don't know where all of this is going to end up.
Heidi, you heard today, so they're talking about the fact that many Venezuelans are asking what the objective is of the U.S., how all this plays out, at a time when more questions are being asked about what the U.S.'s end game is in all of this. Can you give our viewers more background as to how all this is playing out?
It's interesting, those very same questions being asked in Venezuela are also being asked here in the United States, given the Trump administration's multiple justifications for these military actions against Venezuela. When it came to the U.S. airstrikes on vessels, smaller vessels leaving Venezuela, the Trump administration said it was to attack narco traffickers. Now, when it comes to the seizures of oil tankers, Trump is saying that Venezuela has taken the U.S.'s oil assets without providing evidence, and saying that the profits from the oil industry is fueling narco trafficking. But the background of all of that, though, is according to many of Trump's closest advisors, including his Secretary of State, regime change is ultimately one of the goals here. And just as Teresa has said, the Maduro government has not been something that the U.S. has supported for a very long time. And so now, if regime change, in fact, is the goal here, that's meeting plenty of criticism coming even from some other Republicans in Congress.
I consider it a provocation and a prelude to war, and I hope we don't go to war with Venezuela. Look, at any point in time, there are 20, 30 governments around the world that we don't like that are either socialist or communist or have human rights violations. We could really literally go through a couple dozen, but it isn't the job of the American soldier to be the policeman of the world. So I'm not for confiscating these liners. I'm not for blowing up these boats of unarmed people that are suspected of being drug dealers.
And that was Republican Senator Rand Paul, who is an avowed non-interventionalist. But the criticism expands beyond that. Congress is now examining the legality of these U.S. airstrikes that have killed 104 people and counting in the waters off of Venezuela. And the questions of whether the U.S. has a right to seize this oil is yet another open legal question that is being asked.
Teresa, you, of course, are in Buenos Aires. From your vantage point, what are we hearing about all that's going on in other Latin American countries, and how is all this playing out in regional capitals?
Well, the situation in Venezuela has had an impact all across the region, not only because of what's happening politically in Venezuela, but also because of the number of people that have left the country, and many have ended up here in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, among many others. And certainly there's lots of divisions about how to deal with this. There was a meeting of the Mercosur summit in the Brazilian city of Foz do Iguaçu, where there were strong disagreements between Argentinian President Javier Milei and Brazil's President Lula da Silva. And while Milei was saying and supporting the United States intervention, calling Nicolas Maduro a narco-terrorist, saying that the time of being warm against Venezuela was up, that it was a time to be proactive, to seek change and free the Venezuelan people. Lula da Silva was completely different. He was saying about and warning about the risks of a U.S. intervention would have in the region, saying that it would be a very dangerous precedent. He also said that he would like to have a conversation with U.S. President Donald Trump before Christmas, trying to find a diplomatic solution. Nicolas Maduro has become increasingly isolated in Latin America, especially after the elections in July last year. There were lots of accusations about the irregularities that happened there, and the government, the Venezuelan government, of failing to show the tally sheets, the results that proclaim Nicolas Maduro as the winner. And since then, many of those who were willing to mediate in a way started to distance themselves. Among them is Gustavo Petro from Colombia, and also Lula da Silva. But even though they have distanced themselves from Maduro, they are increasingly opposed to any type of intervention by the United States. And this is important. They are the voices who are warning about what could happen in the region if the United States continued to step up its pressure against Nicolas Maduro. And then you have presidents like Javier Milei, a right-wing president that's openly calling for change in Venezuela, openly calling for intervention in Venezuela, and him and some others here in the region too would support anything that the United States does.
All right, that's Teresa Bo live for us from Buenos Aires, and Heidi Jo Castro in Washington, D.C. It's a fast-moving story. We appreciate you both joining us and providing us with all the latest details. Thanks so much.
Don't miss out and get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.